Hello, my name is Kyle Moran. I am a finance and resource economics major at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. This is my junior year writing speech. I will be talking about the impacts of animal agriculture on the environment. Those of us who are environmentally conscious do our best to reduce our carbon footprint by adjusting our lifestyles. We know that a great amount of carbon dioxide is released from our vehicles, so many opt to drive a fuel-efficient car, or maybe carpool, or ride a bike to work. When told that standard light bulbs used too much energy, we changed them to more efficient models and began to turn off the lights when we left the room. Now, if we were faced with the fact that meat production is the leading cause of climate change, how many of us would begin to question our diets? Animal agriculture and meat production has increasingly been a topic of investigation as far as its environmental impact. Brian Walsh, an author for Time magazine, wrote, "There may be no other single human activity that has a bigger impact on the planet than the raising of livestock." The Food and Agriculture Organization reported that the livestock industry accounted for 18% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation, on the other hand, is responsible for 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. This makes the meat industry the leading cause of atmospheric pollution that is responsible for climate change, though it's not heavily discussed. Further extensive research from the World Bank, who looked specifically at animal agriculture, showed that animal agriculture could be responsible for as much as 51% of greenhouse gas emissions. Cows alone produce 150 billion gallons of methane per day. Methane can be 25 to 100 times more destructive on the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. Approximately 30% of the Earth's surface today is used to raise chickens, pigs, cattle, and other livestock. This is land that was once wildlife habitat that has been transformed into land for raising livestock. The biggest threat to the decline of species is habitat destruction, and animal agriculture is one of the main contributors. For example, the Amazon rainforest has lost 20% of its forests over the last 40 years. About 65 to 70% of that 20% can be attributed to land cleared for cattle ranching. The U.S. has found a somewhat solution to the demand for land that comes with animal agriculture. U.S. meat producers cram their livestock into factory farms called confined feeding operations, also known as CAFOs for short. However, these farms produce massive cesspools of manure that release harmful methane into the environment, as well as posing several ethical problems. The global human population is still increasing alarmingly, and countries that never ate meat as a staple food are now starting to shift their tastes. China, for example, in response to its growing middle class, has seen increasing meat demand as incomes in the country rise. Aside from animal rights issues, there's another problem with fattening up approximately 90 million head of cattle on grain. It just takes way too many resources. More than half of the grain produced in the U.S. is going straight to feeding livestock. Imagine if we fed the hungry with this grain, instead of using it to produce meat. In addition to staggering amounts of grain, producing meat takes an incredible amount of water. It's estimated that raising 1 ton of cattle for consumption requires a staggering 4 million gallons of water. This is according to a New York Times article. 660 gallons of water are used to produce just one single hamburger. This is compared to vegetables, which use about 85,000 gallons of water per ton produced. As freshwater access becomes more worrisome, we need to consider if it's being put to good use. Taking into account the carbon footprint, land use, grain, and water intake, producing meat at the current levels is unsustainable. Clearly, we cannot simply force everyone on the planet to adopt a vegetarian or vegan diet. However, the social change that accompanied the environmental awareness movement could also apply to meat consumption. Those of us who choose to bring a reusable shopping bag to the grocery store may also make the decision not to buy beef that day. Accounting only for emissions from food production, the average meat eater produces 2.5 tons of carbon dioxide per year. Simply cutting out beef would reduce that number to 1.9 tons of carbon dioxide per year. Going vegetarian reduces it further to 1.7 tons, and becoming a vegan further reduces it to 1.5 tons. It should be reasonable to ask anyone that cares about the environment to reduce their meat intake. The government could also intervene by passing legislation regarding the conditions in which animals are kept. This legislation would increase the cost of raising livestock for farmers, and if the upkeep costs increase, it would in turn increase the price for beef, which could curb consumer demand. If you're more interested in this topic, I suggest taking a look at the documentary Cowspiracy, which can be found on Netflix. Thank you for tuning into my speech. I will now open it up for questions.